A black billionaire sat in her luxury SUV on a dusty red dirt road. Outside, a frail old man with a bundle of firewood on his head stumbled toward the car, his voice trembling as he called out, "Daughter, is that you?" The man beside her reached for the door handle, but she grabbed his wrist. "Drive!" she hissed at the chauffeur. The window rolled up, sealing away the old man's desperate eyes. The SUV sped off, leaving him collapsed in the dust, arms reaching toward nothing. What kind of wound could turn a daughter's heart to stone? The truth had been festering for 20 years, but it all started to surface 3 days earlier. 3 days before that dusty road changed everything, Ellie Carter stood in her penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. At 35 years old, she had built Carter Holdings into a real estate empire worth over $2 billion. Forbes had named her one of the most powerful black women in America. She had everything: the cars, the properties, the respect of Wall Street, and a past she had buried so deep she almost believed it never existed. Carlos Thompson walked into the living room, his architect's portfolio tucked under his arm. They had been together for 2 years, engaged for 3 months, and he still knew almost nothing about her childhood. "I finished packing," he said, excitement lighting up his face. "I can't believe I'm finally going to meet your father. You've barely mentioned him." Ellie's jaw tightened. "There's not much to mention. We'll stop by briefly, pay our respects, then head back. He doesn't like visitors." Carlos frowned. "Pay our respects? Ellie, he's your father, not a distant relative. I want to know where you came from. I want to understand." Her phone rang, cutting him off. She glanced at the screen. Marcus Webb, her CFO. "I need to take this," she said, already walking toward the balcony. Carlos watched her go, something unsettled stirring in his chest. Through the glass door, he could see her pacing, her voice low but urgent. He moved closer, pretending to adjust a painting on the wall. "Make sure the books are clean before the audit," Ellie hissed into the phone. "No one can know about that fund. Do you understand me? No one." She ended the call and turned to find Carlos standing near the door. Her expression shifted instantly, cold steel melting into practiced warmth. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just routine company stuff." She kissed his cheek and walked past him. "We should leave early tomorrow. It's a long drive to Maplewood." Maplewood. Carlos had searched for the town online and found almost nothing. A rural community in the deep south, population under 3,000. No major employers, no attractions, no reason for anyone to stay. And yet Ellie Carter had come from there. The next morning, they climbed into the black SUV with their driver, Raymond, at the wheel. The city gave way to suburbs, then farmland, then long stretches of nothing but trees and sky. Ellie stared out the window, her fingers drumming against her thigh. "Tell me about growing up here," Carlos said gently. "What was it like?" Ellie's reflection in the glass showed no emotion. "Poor, hot, nothing worth remembering." "Everyone has memories worth remembering. Good or bad, they made you who you are." Ellie turned to face him, something flickering behind her eyes. For a moment, Carlos thought she might actually open up. Instead, she looked away. "Some things are better left buried, Carlos." But the memories came anyway, uninvited. She was 8 years old again, standing at the schoolyard gate in a dress her father had sewn from old curtains. The other children circled her like vultures. "Your daddy's the firewood man," a boy shouted. "I saw him carrying sticks on his head like a donkey." "Ellie's poor. Ellie's poor." The chorus grew louder. Then she saw him, her father, Elijah, walking toward the school to pick her up. His clothes were covered in sawdust and dirt, sweat dripping down his dark face. He smiled when he saw her, that wide, loving smile that showed his missing tooth. "Daddy's here, baby girl," he called out. The children erupted in laughter. Ellie's face burned with shame. She turned and ran, leaving her father standing alone at the gate, his arms slowly falling to his sides, his smile fading into something broken. She never let him pick her up from school again. "Ellie?" Carlos's voice pulled her back to the present. "You went somewhere just now." She blinked, realizing her eyes were wet. She wiped them quickly. "Just tired." Carlos reached for her hand. "You know, I understand shame more than you think." Ellie stiffened but didn't pull away. "My father was a carpenter," Carlos continued, his voice softening with old pain. "He built furniture with his hands. Beautiful pieces, real craftsmanship. But my mother's family thought he wasn't good enough. They called him a common laborer behind his back. My mother started believing them." He looked out at the passing fields, his jaw tight. "She left him when I was 15. Took me to live with her wealthy new husband. My father moved into a small apartment across town. I visited him when I could, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough." Carlos's grip on Ellie's hand tightened. "He died alone in that apartment, heart attack. Nobody found him for 3 days. And my mother, she didn't even come to the funeral. She was afraid her friends would find out she'd once been married to a carpenter." His voice cracked. "I lost my father twice, Ellie. Once to death, and once to shame. Someone else's shame." Ellie sat frozen, unable to respond. Carlos's story hit too close to something she couldn't name. She pulled her hand away and turned back to the window. "I'm sorry about your father," she said quietly. "But my situation is different." Carlos wanted to ask how, but the look on her face told him the conversation was over. Hours later, the SUV turned onto a narrow dirt road. The pavement disappeared, replaced by red clay that kicked up clouds of dust. Wooden shacks dotted the landscape. Children played in yards with no grass. Old men sat on porches, watching the expensive car roll past like it was a spaceship from another world. Ellie's breathing grew shallow. Her fingers gripped the leather seat. "Almost there," Raymond announced. Then she saw him. An old man walked along the side of the road, a massive bundle of firewood balanced on his head. His back was bent, his clothes ragged, his steps slow and labored. He looked like he might collapse at any moment. Ellie's heart stopped. The old man turned at the sound of the approaching vehicle. His eyes, those familiar, gentle eyes, found the SUV. Found the window, found her face behind the glass. His expression transformed. Joy, disbelief, desperate hope. "Ellie?" His voice was barely audible through the closed window. "Ellie! My daughter!" He stumbled toward the car, the firewood toppling from his head, scattering across the road. Carlos sat up straight. "Ellie, that man knows your name. Is that—" "Drive," Ellie commanded, her voice ice cold. Raymond hesitated. "Ma'am? I said drive, now." Carlos grabbed her arm. "Wait, he's calling for you. Is that your father? Ellie?" She yanked her arm free and hit the button to raise the window higher, as if the glass wasn't already closed. "I don't know him," she said through clenched teeth. "He's confused. Some crazy old man from the village." The SUV accelerated, spraying dust behind it. Through the rear window, Carlos watched the old man fall to his knees in the road, his hands reaching toward the disappearing car. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he gathered his scattered firewood piece by piece, alone in the brutal sun. Carlos turned to look at Ellie. She stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone, but her hands were trembling. That evening, they checked into a small motel in the nearest town. The silence between them had grown thick and suffocating. Carlos couldn't hold back any longer. "That was him, wasn't it?" he said as soon as the door closed. "That old man with the firewood. He's your father." Ellie threw her purse onto the bed. "I told you I don't know him." "He knew your name, Ellie. He called you his daughter. I saw your face. You recognized him." She spun around, her eyes blazing. "There's nothing to recognize." I don't have family here. I made myself from nothing. Everything I am, I built alone." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. Carlos caught a glimpse before she could hide it. 3 letters, SEC. She deleted the message quickly, but her hands were shaking worse than before. "What was that?" Carlos asked. "SEC? As in Securities and Exchange Commission?" "It's nothing." Ellie grabbed her phone and headed for the bathroom. "Just spam. I need to shower." The door slammed shut. Carlos stood alone in the room, surrounded by lies he was only beginning to unravel. He thought about the old man on the road, those desperate eyes, those trembling hands. And he thought about his own father dying alone because the people who should have loved him were too ashamed to claim him. Something cold settled in Carlos's stomach. He was starting to see who Ellie Carter really was. The next morning, Carlos woke before dawn. Ellie was still asleep, her face troubled even in rest. He dressed quietly and slipped out of the motel room. He had to know the truth. Raymond was waiting by the SUV, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when Carlos approached. "I need you to take me back to that road," Carlos said. "The one where we saw the old man yesterday." Raymond shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Miss Carter specifically said—" "Miss Carter is asleep. This will be quick." 20 minutes later, Carlos stood on the same dusty road where they had seen the old man collapse. The scattered firewood was gone now, but the memory of those desperate hands reaching toward the car remained burned in his mind. He walked toward a cluster of small houses nearby. An elderly woman sat on a wooden porch, shelling peas into a tin bucket. She looked up as Carlos approached, her eyes narrowing with suspicion at his expensive clothes. "Excuse me, ma'am," Carlos said gently. "I'm looking for information about an old man who lives around here. He carries firewood. His name might be Elijah." The woman's weathered face softened. "You mean Elijah Carter? Poor soul. His house is down that path about a quarter mile. But why would a fancy man like you be asking about him?" Carlos knelt beside her porch, bringing himself to her eye level. "Please, I need to know about him, about his family." The old woman studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed, her hands continuing their work with the peas. "Elijah's been alone for near 20 years now. His wife, God rest her brave, died when their daughter was just a little thing. He raised that girl by himself, working every job he could find. Cutting wood, hauling crops, cleaning stables, anything to keep food on the table and clothes on her back." She shook her head slowly. "That girl was everything to him. Smart as a whip, pretty as a picture. He used to walk 5 miles each way to take her to school because he couldn't afford the bus fare. Saved every penny so she could have books, have a future." Carlos's throat tightened. "What happened to her?" "She left." The old woman's voice carried decades of witnessed heartbreak. Day she turned 18, she packed a bag and walked out. Told Elijah she'd never come back to this place. Called it a hell she wanted to forget. The peas fell into the bucket with soft thuds. Elijah never stopped loving her, though. He keeps her picture on his wall like a shrine. Every time a fancy car passes through, which isn't often, he walks out hoping it might be her. Yesterday was the first time in 20 years he actually saw her. She looked up at Carlos, her eyes sharp with understanding. "That was her in that big black car, wasn't it? Ellie. The one they talk about on the news sometimes. The Billionaire." Carlos couldn't speak. He nodded. "And she drove right past him." It wasn't a question. Lord have mercy. That man has been dying of a broken heart for 20 years, and his own daughter won't even roll down her window. Carlos thanked the woman and walked back to the SUV in silence. His mind was reeling, but one thing was crystal clear. Ellie had lied about everything. When he returned to the motel, Ellie was awake, pacing the room with her phone pressed to her ear. She hung up quickly when she saw him. "Where were you?" she demanded. Carlos closed the door behind him. I went back to the village. I spoke to the neighbors. Ellie's face went pale. You had no right. Elijah Carter, Carlos cut her off. Your father, the man who raised you alone after your mother died, the man who walked 5 miles to take you to school, the man who saved every penny so you could have a future. Ellie backed away as if his words were physical blows. And you left him, Carlos continued, his voice rising. You left him and never looked back. You built your empire, put your face on magazine covers, and let the world believe you came from nothing. But you didn't come from nothing, Ellie. You came from him, from his sacrifice. From his love. You don't understand, Ellie's voice cracked. You don't know what it was like. Then tell me, Carlos shouted. Make me understand how you can look at your own father, broken, poor, carrying firewood on his head, and drive away like he's a stranger. Ellie's composure shattered. Tears streamed down her face as years of buried shame came flooding to the surface. You want to know what it was like? She screamed back. It was humiliation every single day, being the girl with the torn shoes and the homemade dresses, being called the firewood man's daughter like it was a disease. She grabbed the edge of the dresser, steadying herself. Do you know what it's like to watch your father be treated like an animal? To see people throw coins at him like he's a beggar? To have children laugh at you because your daddy smells like sweat and wood smoke? Her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. I hated that life. I hated what it made me feel. And yes, I hated him for not being more, for not being better, for not giving me a father I could be proud of. Carlos stared at her, heartbreak and disgust warring on his face. He gave you everything he had. It wasn't enough. Ellie collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking with sobs. It was never enough. The memory came then, unbidden and merciless. She was 18 again, standing in the doorway of their tiny shack with a single bag over her shoulder. Her father stood before her, his calloused hands holding out a small envelope. It's everything I saved, Elijah had said, his voice trembling. $342. It's not much, but it'll help you get started in the city. Young Ellie had looked at the crumpled bills with contempt. That's 17 years of your life, Daddy. $300. That's what your whole existence amounts to. Elijah's face crumpled. Baby girl, I tried. I tried so hard. Don't call me that. Ellie had stepped back from his reaching hands. I'm leaving this place and I'm never coming back. Don't look for me. Don't write to me. As far as I'm concerned, I have no father. She had turned and walked away without looking back. But she heard him calling her name over and over, his voice breaking into sobs. She heard him fall to his knees in the doorway, and she kept walking. Carlos sat down heavily in the chair by the window. The distance between them felt infinite. My father died alone, he said quietly. 3 days before anyone found him, and the whole time I blamed my mother for being ashamed of him, for treating him like he wasn't worthy of her love. He looked at Ellie with eyes full of sorrow. But you're worse than my mother ever was. At least she visited him sometimes. At least she let him see me. You erased your father completely. You let him spend 20 years wondering if his daughter was even alive. Ellie had no defense. She knew he was right. 2 weeks later, they returned to New York in separate cars. The engagement wasn't officially broken, but something between them had died on that dusty road in Maplewood. Ellie threw herself back into work, desperate to outrun the memories. But the SEC investigation was closing in. Every day brought new subpoenas, new document requests. New lawyers huddled in conference rooms with grave expressions. Then the FBI came. It was a Tuesday morning just after 9. Ellie was in her corner office reviewing quarterly reports when the elevator doors opened and a dozen agents in Navy windbreakers flooded the floor. Ellie Carter? The lead agent flashed his badge. FBI, you're under arrest for securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists in front of her entire staff. Cameras flashed. Someone had tipped off the press. By noon, her face was on every news channel in America. The woman who had built an empire on secrets watched it all crumble in a single morning. In the weeks that followed, the details emerged. Marcus Webb, her CFO, had cut a deal with prosecutors. He testified that Ellie had orchestrated a complex scheme to inflate property values, hide income through shell companies, and defraud investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of it was true, some of it was exaggeration, and some of it was outright lies. Marcus covering his own tracks by pointing the finger at her. But the truth didn't matter anymore. Ellie Carter, the black billionaire who had risen from nothing, was now a symbol of corporate greed and corruption. 3 months into her time at the Federal Detention Center, Ellie barely recognized herself. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The penthouse views were gone, replaced by concrete walls. The power, the respect, the carefully constructed identity, all of it stripped away. She sat alone in her cell, staring at the small mirror bolted to the wall. A black woman in prison clothes stared back at her. "This is what you were afraid of," a voice whispered in her mind. "This is what you ran from your whole life. Being nothing. Being nobody. Being just another poor black face that the world doesn't care about." And the cruel irony was that she had done this to herself. Every lie, every scheme, every compromise of her integrity, it had all been to escape the shame of poverty. And now she had nothing left, nothing except regret. Carlos came to visit her once, 3 months after the arrest. She had begged him through her lawyer, one final meeting before her trial. He sat across from her at the metal table, his face thinner than she remembered, his eyes carrying a heaviness that hadn't been there before. "I was wrong," Ellie whispered, her voice raw from weeks of crying. "About everything. About what matters. About who I am." Carlos listened in silence. "I need you to do something for me," she continued. "Not for us. I know there is no us anymore. But please, I need you to find my father. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I was a coward and a fool. Tell him—" Her voice broke. "Tell him his daughter loves him. That she always loved him, even when she was too broken to show it." Carlos's expression was unreadable. "Why should I do this for you?" "Not for me." Ellie gripped the edge of the table. "For him. He deserves to know. Before I spend the next 10 years in prison, I need him to know that I'm sorry. Please, Carlos. You understand what it means to lose a father. Don't let him die thinking I never cared." Something shifted in Carlos's eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something like recognition. "I'll find him," Carlos said finally. "But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because no father should die wondering if his child loved him. Mine did. I won't let yours." He stood up and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "I hope you find peace, Ellie. I really do." Then he was gone. 1 week later, Carlos drove back to Maplewood alone. The red dirt roads were familiar now, haunted by memories of that terrible day. He found the path the old woman had described and followed it to a small wooden house at the end. The house was dark. The door stood open, creaking in the wind. Carlos's heart began to pound. He stepped inside and found emptiness. A single bed neatly made, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and on the wall, a faded photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a wide smile. Ellie, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Before the shame took root, a neighbor appeared in the doorway, a middle-aged man with a solemn face. "You looking for Elijah?" the man asked. Carlos nodded, afraid to speak. "You're too late." The neighbor removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "He passed about 2 weeks ago. Lung disease. Had it for years but couldn't afford the treatment. He just kept getting weaker and weaker." Carlos leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly unsteady. Nearly 3 months. Elijah had survived nearly 3 months after that day on the road, waiting, hoping, refusing to let go until his body gave out. In the end, he couldn't even get out of bed, the neighbor continued. Some of us took turns checking on him, bringing him food. But there wasn't nothing we could do. He just faded away. The man's voice grew thick with emotion. Last thing he said, right before he went, was her name. Ellie. Kept saying it over and over like he was calling her home. Carlos closed his eyes, grief washing over him. For Elijah, for his own father, for all the fathers abandoned by the people who should have loved them most. Did he leave anything behind? Carlos managed to ask. The neighbor nodded toward the table. Just that letter there. He wrote it a few months back when he still had the strength. Asked me to send it if I ever found out where his daughter was, but none of us knew how to reach a billionaire. Carlos walked to the table. A single envelope lay there, yellowed and worn from being handled countless times. On the front, in shaky handwriting, was one word: Ellie. He picked it up carefully, as if it might crumble in his hands. Then he drove back to tell Ellie that her father was dead. The visiting room at the detention center felt colder than before. Ellie sat across from Carlos, her eyes searching his face for hope. She found none. I went to Maplewood, Carlos said quietly. I found his house. Ellie leaned forward. Is he okay? Did you tell him? He's gone, Ellie. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. What? Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. He died 2 weeks ago. Lung disease. He couldn't afford treatment, so he just... Carlos's jaw tightened. He survived almost 3 months after we saw him on that road. 3 months of hoping you'd come back. And he died in that little house, still waiting. Ellie's world collapsed. She heard screaming, a raw, animal sound of pure anguish, and didn't realize it was coming from her own throat. No, 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 no! She slammed her fists against the table. He can't be gone. I was going to apologize. I was going to make it right. Guards rushed in, grabbing her arms, but she fought against them with a strength born of absolute despair. Let me go! I have to see him! Daddy! Daddy! Carlos watched as they dragged her away, her screams echoing off the concrete walls. He placed the letter on the table, the last words of a father who had loved his daughter until his final breath. And Ellie would have to read them in a prison cell, knowing she could never say goodbye. 6 months after her arrest, Ellie was granted permission to visit her father's grave. Marcus Webb had finally admitted to fabricating several of the most serious charges against her, and the prosecution's case was crumbling. Her lawyers had petitioned for a supervised trip to Maplewood as a humanitarian gesture, and the judge had agreed. She made the journey in the back of a prison transport van, her wrists bound in handcuffs, 2 guards sitting across from her. The same red dirt roads passed by the window, but everything looked different now. The shame she had felt as a child seemed so small compared to the weight she carried today. The van stopped at a small cemetery on the edge of the village. Wildflowers grew between the headstones, and ancient oak trees cast long shadows across the graves. Ellie stepped out into the afternoon sun, her orange jumpsuit bright against the muted colors of the burial ground. The guards led her to a simple grave near the back fence. A concrete marker rose from the earth. Rough and handmade, someone had carved words into its surface with careful, loving strokes. Elijah Carter, beloved father of Ellie. That was all. No dates, no Bible verses, no elaborate epitaph. Just those 4 words, because being her father was the thing he had been most proud of. Ellie fell to her knees in the red dirt. Daddy, she whispered. Daddy, I'm here. I finally came home. The guards stepped back, giving her space. Even hardened men knew when to look away from grief this raw. I'm so sorry, Ellie sobbed, her fingers digging into the earth as if she could reach him through the soil. I was so ashamed of you, so ashamed of where I came from. I thought if I could just get far enough away, become someone else entirely, the pain would stop. She pressed her forehead against the rough concrete marker. But it never stopped. Every success I had, every dollar I made, every time someone called me powerful or important, none of it filled the hole I created when I left you. I just kept running and running, and I didn't realize I was running away from the only person who ever loved me without conditions. The letter. She had read it 100 times in her cell, until the paper grew soft from her tears and the words were burned into her memory. "My dearest Ellie," her father had written in his shaky hand. "I do not write this letter to make you feel guilty. I write it because I need you to know the truth before God takes me home. I was never ashamed of our life. I was never ashamed of being poor. The only thing that ever broke my heart was watching you carry shame that was never yours to carry. You were my greatest joy, my reason for waking up every morning. When you left, you took the sun with you. But I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day. I kept your picture on my wall and talked to it every night. I told you about my day, about the weather, about the neighbors, foolish old man things. But it made me feel close to you. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Please do not cry for me too long. I lived a full life, and I will die knowing that I was the father of the most remarkable woman I ever knew." Yes, remarkable. Because you survived things that would have broken anyone else. You built something from nothing. You made your dreams come true. I only wish I could have been part of those dreams. I love you, baby girl. I always have. I always will. And wherever I am going, I will keep a light on for you. Your daddy Ellie stayed at the grave until the sun began to set. The guards finally approached, their voices gentle as they helped her to her feet. "Ma'am, we need to go." She nodded, unable to speak, but before she turned away, she pressed her palm flat against the marker one last time. "I'll make you proud, Daddy. I swear I will. Whatever's left of my life, I'll spend it making you proud." The trial concluded 4 months later, with Marcus Webb's confession that he had exaggerated and fabricated evidence to save himself. The most serious charges against Ellie were dropped. She pleaded guilty to the remaining counts of tax evasion and fraud, accepting responsibility for the crimes she had actually committed. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison. It was far less than the 8 years the prosecution had originally sought, but it was still 5 years of concrete walls and metal bars. 5 years of orange jumpsuits and institutional food. 5 years to sit with her guilt and try to become someone worthy of her father's love. On the day she was transferred to the federal correctional facility, Carlos came to see her one last time. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, the same metal table between them, the same harsh fluorescent lights overhead. But something had shifted. The anger in Carlos's eyes had faded, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of sorrow, compassion, and finality. "I forgive you," Carlos said quietly, "for lying to me, for hiding who you really were. I understand now that you were running from something bigger than I realized." Ellie's eyes filled with tears. "Carlos, He held up his hand. "Let me finish. I forgive you, Ellie, but I can't be with you. Every time I look at you, I see my father dying alone in that apartment. I see your father dying alone in that shack. I see all the love that gets thrown away because people are too proud or too scared or too ashamed to hold on to it." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I can't build a life with someone who reminds me of that kind of loss. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." Ellie nodded slowly. She had known this moment was coming. Perhaps she had known it since that day on the dusty road when she chose her pride over her father's outstretched hands. "Thank you," she whispered, "for going to Maplewood, for bringing me his letter. You gave me the only gift that matters anymore." Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. the faded photograph of young Ellie that had hung on Elijah's wall for 20 years. "He would have wanted you to have this," Carlos said, sliding it across the table. Ellie picked up the photograph with trembling hands. She stared at her own 8-year-old face, back when her smile was still innocent, back when she still believed her father was the strongest man in the world. "I was so happy then," she said softly. "I didn't even know it." Carlos stood up, preparing to leave. At the door, he turned back one last time. "I hope you find peace, Ellie. I hope you find a way to honor him. He deserved better than what life gave him. But he loved you until the end. That has to count for something." Then he walked out of her life forever. 5 years passed. Ellie served her sentence quietly, causing no trouble, earning no enemies. She worked in the prison library, helping other inmates learn to read. She attended therapy sessions where she unpacked decades of shame and self-hatred. She wrote letters to her father that she could never send, telling him about her days, about the small victories and the long nights. On the morning of her release, she walked through the prison gates with nothing but a small bag of personal belongings and the photograph of her 8-year-old self. No one was waiting for her. No cameras, no reporters, no family. The billionaire who had once commanded headlines was now just another ex-convict starting over. She used what little money remained after her legal fees to rent a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town. She got a job at a local nonprofit, answering phones and filing paperwork. She lived simply, ate simply, wanted simply. And she started a foundation. She called it Elijah's Hands, named for the rough, calloused hands that had carried firewood and hauled crops and held her close when she was small. The foundation helped single fathers in poverty, men like her own father, who sacrificed everything for their children and received nothing in return. It paid for medical care, job training, school supplies, and emergency housing. It gave these men something Ellie had never given her own father: dignity and recognition. 2 years after her release, Ellie was driving down a country road when she saw him. An old black man, thin and weathered, walking along the shoulder with a bundle of firewood balanced on his head. His steps were slow and unsteady. His clothes were worn and patched. Ellie's heart clenched so hard she could barely breathe. She pulled her pickup truck to the side of the road and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The old man looked up, startled by the approaching stranger. "Sir," Ellie said gently, "can I help you carry that?" The old man squinted at her. "You don't have to trouble yourself, miss. I've been carrying wood my whole life." "I know," Ellie said, her voice catching, "but you shouldn't have to carry it alone." She reached up and helped him lower the bundle from his head. Together, they loaded it into the bed of her truck. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Just down the road a piece. Small house with the blue door." "Let me drive you." The old man studied her face with curiosity. "Why would a stranger do this for an old man like me?" Ellie looked at him, really looked, and saw her father's eyes staring back at her. Not the same man, but the same spirit, the same quiet dignity, the same lifetime of labor written in every line of his face. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago," she said, "and I'm trying to make up for lost time." She drove him to his house with the blue door. She helped him unload the firewood and stack it neatly against the wall. Before she left, she pressed a card into his hand, the number for Elijah's Hands. "If you ever need anything," she said, "you call this number. There are people who want to help." The old man looked at the card, then back at her. His eyes glistened. "God bless you, miss. God bless you." Ellie climbed back into her truck and drove away. In the rearview mirror, she watched the old man wave until she rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. Then she pulled over, rested her head on the steering wheel, and wept. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered to the empty air. I'm sorry I didn't stop for you. I'm sorry I drove away. I'm sorry I let you die alone. She sat there for a long time, crying for the father she had lost and the years she could never reclaim. But when she finally lifted her head, something had shifted inside her. The guilt was still there. It would always be there, a scar she would carry forever. But beneath it was something else. Something that felt almost like purpose. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't bring her father back. She couldn't undo the cruelty of that day on the dusty road. But she could spend the rest of her life making sure no other father was left behind. She could keep stopping, keep helping, keep honoring the man who had loved her unconditionally, even when she gave him nothing in return. Ellie wiped her eyes, started the engine, and drove on. There was work to be done.